I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to this special edition episode of the RANE podcast series. In this episode, founder of RANE, David Lawrence, sits down with Dr. Mark Gold for a discussion on dopamine and its contribution to substance abuse and addiction amongst younger generations. Dr. Mark Gold is an author, inventor, mentor, and world-renowned expert on addiction-related diseases and frequent guest on our show. Dr. Gold has had over 1,000 peer-reviewed publications since beginning his academic career at the University of Florida College of Medicine and Yale University School of Medicine in the 1970s. Dr. Gold has modernized addiction and psychiatric training, fellowship, and treatment programs while hopeful that research would translate into new, more effective treatments. Check out Dr. Mark Gold's full bio and host of written publications at psychologytoday.com. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey Mark, again, always great to catch up with you and the great research you're doing and advocacy. The topic today, and I thought you had a great idea, is to talk about dopamine and what it is and why it's so powerful and why it seems to be so important, both in terms of substance abuse disorders, but also what we're seeing, particularly amongst younger people in terms of everything, their engagement with social media and gambling and pornography and everything else.
Good news here is that I taught neuroanatomy. That was the principal thing I taught since 1972. And the way to make neuroanatomy interesting and fun for students is to talk about drugs, sex, and rock and roll. And you can't talk about drugs, sex, and rock and roll without talking about dopamine. So the way the brain, part of the way that it gets us to do things that have species survival significance, meaning keeping human beings alive, is that it reinforces, meaning that it releases a little chemical that says, good boy or girl, do that again, every time you do something it wants. So what it wants the most is to be sure you eat. So therefore, dopamine reinforces eating. And it even goes a little further than that. We won't go into all the details, but it might reinforce fatty foods or foods that might enable you to store calories or nutrients for fasts. Because in the old days, there wasn't Costco, there was hunting, and you had to kill and bring back the food to the tribe or there'd be nothing to eat. So there was a extra reinforcement for eating things that could be stored in your own bodies for later times that were lean. Next, you of course have to have sex. So dopamine is released after sex, again to say that was the right thing to do. Thank you for trying to preserve the species. And dopamine is released in social interactions, talking to people, helping somebody. And in social groups, dopamine can be released for social cohesion. How we learned about dopamine and how important it was is part of this story. So it goes back to early work that we did and colleagues did in the late 70s when there was a cocaine epidemic. And at that time, cocaine was declared non-addicting, the champagne of drugs, safe to take. And at the same time, people from Saturday Night Live and from celebrity in sports and in movies and so forth said, I don't know what these psychiatrists are talking about. I'm addicted to this drug. And that got everybody to say, well, what did cocaine do? And how could cocaine be addicting and so powerful, but not be like alcohol and not be like opioids, not be like heroin, and not have a withdrawal syndrome like that, but still be so compelling that it drives repeat use, in the absence of this terrible withdrawal syndrome. And you'd have to put yourself back in the 70s, which is easy for me because I lived through it. We used to think that people used heroin to just reverse withdrawal. Like they had heroin withdrawal, they used heroin. They had alcohol withdrawal, they used alcohol to escape withdrawal. And in cocaine's case, it wasn't like that at all. It was like you wanted more of it because you liked the feeling. You wanted more of it and more of it and more of it. So it turned out that cocaine blocked dopamine reuptake in the brain's principal pleasure center, meaning it was at the end of the whole species survival reinforcement cascade. So even opioids, when they cause repeat use, do it in part through dopamine. Cannabis through dopamine. All drugs of abuse cause dopamine released at the so-called nucleus accumbens, which is within the brain and considered the central part of the reinforcement system. So there you go. Why is dopamine so important? Because it's the brain's pleasure messenger. Why is it so important to substance use disorders? Because all drugs of abuse cause dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, regardless of the drug of abuse. If it's a drug of abuse, it causes dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. And then what we found out recently was that so too does pornography, does junk food, does all sorts of gambling, all sorts of behaviors that, especially those where we have bright lights, slot machines, game of chance, where there's anticipation and then reward, or you try again and again and again. So dopamine was found to be essential for behavioral addictions, and that made a lot of sense to scientists because they said, well, that's cocaine, which causes dopamine release and blocks reuptake to a certain extent more than other drugs, and still causes intense craving, intense wanting, drug self-administration to death, meaning you would take the drug if you had unlimited supply, you'd take it to epileptic seizure, where how that all happens, this kind of bad lover, pathological attachment, is the same that for junk food, for digital media, pornography, and gambling.
So Mark, just to put this maybe in different terms, this is the chemical that gets released rewarding certain behavior, and that ultimately has an impact on what I'll refer to as self-restraint and one's will and decision-making. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, so I mean, if you have to choose among all things, you'd say, like, why is it that people don't cut up their desk and sniff it? Like, why is it that children don't like broccoli? Why is it that they prefer sugar? Why is it that people don't like documentaries, and so forth? There's a special formula that will give you access to the brain's reinforcement system, and therefore you can shape or change behaviors. Like drugs are only one way in, and that. So if you didn't use drugs, you had no risk. But now you have sports gambling, you have lotteries, you have Facebook and social media, you have pornography, and there are people that have looked at our internet and have said the more we have high speed, the more digital media can addict us. Like in the era of dial-up AOL access, it might have been more difficult to be attracted to video gaming or gambling sites, where right now it's pretty easy, or the same for pornography.
And without getting too far astray, what we're really talking about, I mean, it goes back to ancient Greek philosophers, is whether we determine our own will, our own decision making or not. What I'm hearing you say is that this is the gatekeeper or the chemical which can reward certain behavior, and that ultimately, if triggered often enough, one loses the ability to determine their own decision making, that the brain basically
Yeah, I mean, I think
takes
that,
over. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you have all this, you have access, you have the ability, like if you think about our recent ancestors, and I use the food analogy, they would have to hunt for food. It would be a week or, I mean, a long time, and required a lot of work, and it oftentimes was hunt or be hunted. And so their brain rightly reinforced them for the wonderful food that they ate. Right now, you're a great hunter in Costco or Sam's Club by just having a cart to put food in. And so the reinforcement paradigm has changed, and people lose control over it and become obese. Or you might say, for drugs of abuse, every culture had some drug of abuse, but now we have worldwide communications, and we have every culture's drugs, and they all have slightly different ways of accessing the brain's reinforcement system, but net, they all cause dopamine to be released, cause a new attachment, this one to a drug rather than to being in church singing or being a little league manager, rather than working hard to get brain reward. It would come on every puff of a cigarette or cannabis. Every puff would create the same brain reward or more. If the drug was cocaine you smoked, for example, or fentanyl, the reward would be much greater than the natural rewards even produced by food or sex or survival.
And another way to phrase this is why I know all your work with people who have been addicted, why their value system or priorities shift, and why, getting to the next dose becomes all-encompassing, all-important, and everything else irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think the average person doesn't realize how that old ad, I can't even remember what it was for, but it was "Don't mess with Mother Nature."
Right.
And
yeah, that was I think that was a margarine ad.
Yeah, it was like, it ends up being that it's a house of cards, and
Right.
and so when people talk about putting a person back together again, that's much harder because we don't quite understand how to do that. We understand that when someone says a person is addicted, that they've acquired a new drive equal or greater than the drives of food, water, and sex and survival. And that drive can be triggered by sights, seeing things that were related to the use, sounds, songs, and other things related to the use, smells related to use. I mean, part of the reason we removed cigarette smokers from the workplace was because of secondhand exposure risks, and to just help the people who were trying to stop smoking from being triggered to smoke again. And now if you're in New York City where you are, you can't avoid smelling cannabis. So if you had a cannabis use disorder, I imagine it must be very difficult.
So I think, and I just, for the benefit of many people who are listening to you, the point you're making here about the release of the chemical, what can trigger it, obviously, certain drugs can do that, but sights, sounds, smells. All these things are sort of understood, particularly in the social media world, in the world of gaming, where they do retain staffs of psychologists and psychiatrists, is they understand what it is that can trigger the brain to want to keep coming back, to continue on. The reward system, whether these are the sights or sounds online, whether it's, the encouragement that comes with this, but the algorithms are powerful not simply because of what's being offered, but how it's being delivered.
There's no doubt about this. And once you have this attachment, so it's conditioning, it's Pavlov 101. I mean, basically, you show the dog meat and it salivates. And then, Pavlov actually did experiments with morphine, where he kept morphine in in his lab, but locked away above the sink. And so he would then go to this cabinet, unlock it, take a syringe, bring it to the animal, put the animal's arm down and inject it intravenously. And then, so there were 5 things in the sequence before the injection. And what he found was all he had to do was go to the cabinet and the animal put its arm down. And now in modern day brain imaging, we can show that the brain anticipates the drug because of this bad learning and actually will release dopamine in advance of the drug being delivered. So think about how crazy this is. This is one of the problems in placebo trials, is if a person who's using cocaine thinks he's going to get cocaine, his brain lights up as if it received cocaine before you inject them. Not to the same extent, and it will extinguish over time, but it's important to know that bad learning and this kind of cascade of Pavlovian reinforcement is real, and what separates the addict from the rest of us who have lots of free will. I mean, I always hear people say they could stop taking drugs, or they could stop gambling, or they could stop watching pornography, and it turns out it's not that easy. There's recent cannabis finding where people come to the emergency room with uncontrollable vomiting because of all this high-dose cannabis being around. And so the treatment for that is you tell them, don't smoke marijuana. And it turns out like over 80% of them would rather vomit.
So I'm going to walk back a few
Sorry.
paragraphs. No, this is important. You use the term, it's measurable. When you scan the brain, you can actually see this happening. So this is not theoretical, but this is evidence-based in terms of actually being able to view how the brain is responding. And I still remember, I guess it was under Nancy Reagan, this is your brain on drugs, and it was a fried egg. What I'm hearing from you is that that's actually an inaccurate metaphor. This is your brain, and this is your brain on social media, on gambling sites, on drugs, and it actually more closely resembles the Pavlov's dog hearing the cabinet open.
Yeah, or in that case, it was a monkey, non-human primate, or the dog being presented with food. But I think that the This Is Your Brain on Drugs ad was attempting to describe the risks of methamphetamine or cocaine overdose, which to this day do not have a treatment, and which used to cause people to go, this is really to go way back, but people used to go to the emergency room with temperatures of 105. And clearly, if you've had a child, you have to bring the temperature down. And what we used to do at Yale in the 70s was we'd pack people in ice who had overdosed. So they were really frying their brain on the basis of high body temperatures, but it doesn't capture this bad lover aspect of drugs or this pathological attachment or the drive for something that's going to kill you.
And again, I'll come back to this point that I'm hearing you make, which is that at some point it is no longer a question of free will, because the brain has been altered by the reward system.
At some point, yeah, no one knows when a cucumber becomes the pickle in this analogy. But when it does, then we know a lot. So people have tried to get the field to expand its vision and say, we should be talking about pre-addiction, like we talk about pre-diabetes, because pre-addiction is the time for treatment. Pre-addiction is the time for an intervention. But once a person has a substance use disorder, then they've acquired a chronic, lifelong, relapsing disease for which we do not have a cure, but only palliative treatments.
So let's get to the thesis of our conversation, because I think this has been very helpful in explaining dopamine, explaining its impact on the brain, impact on behavior, impact on, I'll say, Greek philosophical views of free will. Although I will go back, to the tales of Ulysses in the land of the lotus eaters, right? They had to strap the sailors to the mast lest they, jump overboard, if I remember correctly, and couldn't get them off the island. Anyway, detoxing, is that the right word from dopamine? Is it detoxing or detoxing?
Yeah, so basically, Anna Lemke, who is a professor at Stanford, wrote a book in the early 2020, 2021 called Dopamine Nation. And that book was very eye-opening for some people, not for researchers who have been thinking about dopamine as it relates to digital media or pornography or my work in junk foods. And basically what she said was, we live in a world where there's so much access to stimulation that can cause primary rewards through the dopamine system that we're always on the verge of being out of control. And for some people who have pre-existing vulnerabilities to that, maybe a family history of addiction, maybe a personal history of addiction, maybe loneliness and depression, the world's supermarket of things that can overstimulate the dopamine system means that everyone is going to be tested, and some people won't come out without a behavioral addiction. Now, she most recently added to this the notion that artificial intelligence can identify the individual foibles and vulnerabilities that people have and target the person with the dopamine overstimulation most likely to make them addicted. The reason that this is especially alarming is because we don't know in advance for us what it is. Maybe artificial intelligence will be able to find it. And just like we've seen with cannabis, the sellers are not that interested in 0.5% THC cannabis from Woodstock 1 because it wasn't addicting. But once you're at 8, 15, 80% THC inhaled or available in other forms, it's highly addicting, and you can create a whole regular customer base. So yes, she's said basically that we live in this dopamine stimulation bubble, and through digital media, pornography, and everything else out there, the only way for us to survive is to have periods where we can detox from dopamine. Now, you really can't detox from dopamine, so I'd say what she's really proposing is some periods where we're off the grid, where we abstain from activities like social media, other activities, and do things in a more natural sense. And she's called for walks in nature, like reading a book, playing a board game, doing things that are not so very modern and so pleasure rich that easily we can lose control over them. And she's called for dopamine fasting of 30 days or more. And it's interesting, most of her, like, it appears from her books anyway, that many of her patients are Silicon Valley tech wizards who are enmeshed in this environment all the time and need to reset their brains. Otherwise, weaker rewards, societal rewards and relationships, friendships, helping others, aren't that reinforcing. So her whole notion is we're inundated with dopamine. That's changing our brains. It's changing it in a way that we want and need and crave more. We seek out more. We lose control, and we continue to use, even though then our social relationships start to fail and the normal hierarchy of human behavior and emotion is distorted.
So what you're describing about her work seems to have a double edge to it, okay? So obviously highlighting the risks, but it strikes me, Mark, that businesses are being built on recognizing the fact that people are susceptible or vulnerable and are actually using, you referenced artificial intelligence, whatever means they're using these insights to basically drive what I'll refer to as consumer behavior. And apropos your comments, you know, in not just New York, but in other states, they're talking about taking away the cell phones of students. I think in New York, the New York Times was reporting statistics that indicate about 25% of students' day is spent on their phone. I get an alert as though they're congratulating me. Your screen time is up this week. You know, meaning like, you know, with a very, you know, a green arrow, the way, you know, the stock market tape indicates the market's up. You know, with like there's a positive thing, and that's what I'm hearing is we focus on sort of the responsibilities around social media and what we're now learning about the brain and understanding about it. It seems that may be also at the heart of what we'll call it the types of, I'll say, parental controls, Mark, okay, or regulatory guidelines that, you know, has to be around the product offerings, and particularly to those who are, you know, of a vulnerable age, whether it's 18, 21, 25, whatever it is. But understanding what's really going on here. It's not just that these are great games, this is a lot of fun, people like to connect. I'm hearing you say that what we now know is actually in the marketplace being used to drive adoption, consumer behavior, eating habits, viewing habits, gambling habits, etc.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I have no problem with anything you just said. Just like a drug physically changes the brain's dopamine and seeks out more dopamine, and over time, natural rewards like your family or social interaction become less pleasurable. The same thing happens in a behavioral addiction. And people are making choices. I mean, do I text on my cell phone, or do I put a like in a social media, and or do I put the phone down and talk to my parents over dinner time?
Right. In fact, the New York Times today, a terrific story about some students in, they sort of followed the students, I think in maybe as early as junior high, but certainly high school. They formed a club or society called the Luddites, which, basically, it was, to divorce themselves from technology, okay, and involved book reading and walking, all the things you described, and, because they found it was, unhealthful, and then they followed them. I haven't quite finished listening to the full story, but they get to college. Can you survive without a cell phone? Well, they went to a flip phone, which goes back to a point you made at the beginning of this conversation, which is about what speed does to drive
Right.
behavior. Okay, so
Well, that's a funny thing, because when I met Anna Lemke, I
Yeah.
gave grand rounds at Stanford. Either the chairman or someone told me that she only used a flip phone herself. So a prophylaxis is either limiting, and there are many ways that you could limit your smartphone utilization, like, only to the daylight hours. Obviously, if you're a student, like, how does it make sense to have it in class? I mean, I think there was a concern that if phones weren't available to students, they couldn't call 911. But other than that,
that point has been made. Mass shootings, that type of thing. Yes, yes.
other than that, I haven't been able to think of anything good that can come out of a student not being able to learn when they're in school.
Right. And it's interesting. You kind of referenced AOL dial-up service, right? Nothing was more frustrating than to have to wait for the results and to get online and things like that. But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I spoke to somebody once who was I tried to help him with a scale at UF, but he was a sexual compulsivity researcher who worked on like a pencil and paper scale to tell, for example, if you had sexual compulsivity or a sex addiction and compulsive pornography use. And he said that there was no such thing in the dial-up era. It's all dependent on high speed. The more high speed, the more compulsive the visual-related stimuli can become.
So I don't know who trademarked the line from many years ago, Mark, that you will recall. Speed kills.
That was David Smith.
Yeah,
So,
it now takes on another meaning. Is what
yeah. But it is relevant to this point of view, because when you look at prescriptions in tech companies, like, what do the tech company employees take? Like, you often hear about them taking this or that medicine. And the medicines that they take are principally psychostimulants, like Adderall, things for attention deficit, which obviously they don't have, but they're taking these drugs for their ability to suppress being tired, being bored, needing sleep. So I think you do see it is kind of like a speed. It's speed like brain reinforcement, or cocaine like brain reinforcement produced by these things that produce behavioral addiction, but they also might use these similar medicines to keep it going until they totally burn out. Now, maybe you see it in New York. You could also see these guys in like stock trading.
Absolutely, right, in front of the screen all the time, right. Let's go back in the few minutes we have. Give us some
That was
guidelines.
good. Eh? It's a really
No, it's fascinating because it causes the recalibration of how one looks at these issues, Mark, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at things where people have lost control that you haven't, like a lottery ticket. Mark Potenza at Yale has described lottery tickets as a gateway drug for 14-year-olds in his studies in Connecticut. Well, that is so interesting because as a gambling gateway, that's just so important. And you would never put it together if you didn't have this notion that gambling can be an addiction. It's like cocaine in the sense that there's no withdrawal or no dramatic withdrawal per se. And rather than taking the drug or gambling to avoid withdrawal, you're taking the drug to prolong the euphoria.
Well, it's funny. We should go into this a little bit, but I noticed some state lotteries are now putting out a tagline, whether when they're advertising over TV or radio or online in print, about that these games are not for minors, right? And whether these are scratch-off games, which are always fun, and I can remember when my now young adult children were kids, the greatest party favor they got, at least that's what they thought, was there was a multi-million-dollar lottery drawing that Saturday night, and each kid got a ticket. And I still remember that they wanted to stay up for the drawing. It was incredible. Yeah, and wasn't happy with the parents, but anyway, with a few minutes we have remaining, and I want this to be a continuing conversation because I think it's so significant the way you've thought about this and the research you've done, and obviously your connectivity with researchers in a variety of fields. But let's talk about detoxing, decompressing from dopamine, regardless of where you're ingesting it from. And how should people think about this? What are sort of the rules of the road in terms of what people should be looking for, what they should be doing themselves, how they should be thinking about their kids?
When I asked other experts about this idea about detoxing from dopamine, they would, and the world's expert on behavioral addictions is probably Yale's Mark Potenza. And so he said, well, you don't want to overdo this. You can't really detox from dopamine, and it's not like cognitive behavioral therapy, but what it probably is analogous to is for people with alcohol use disorder or cocaine use disorder, how they would go to rehab to get out of their environment and get some distance from the sights, sounds, and stimulations associated with using drugs and kind of get control of themselves and their craving by this radical departure in environment. And he said, getting some distance from your out of control behavior by taking a vacation or unplugging can be liberating and allow the person to re-exert control. So, it would be almost like maybe Teddy Roosevelt used to do that by camping in Mother Nature. Maybe detoxing or taking 30 days without doing XYZ to see if you can re-exert control is certainly a good test. But the applications of this are probably mostly around digital use. And I think Potenza would say, yeah, you should try that if we're talking about Facebook or social media, detoxing from those. We're talking about gambling, but to talk about the use of this for the major addictions, he wasn't a big fan.
And is it a question of moderation with everything?
Well, that's a good one. So, like, again, we can't tell when. That's a preventative strategy. So you can't, like, before you're an alcoholic, you probably can moderate your drinking. We know lots of people who do that, and I don't know. I haven't been a gambler, but I did go to the Kentucky Derby once and gambled there, and I'm sure that the experience of the person who hasn't developed a behavioral addiction doesn't capture the experience of the person who does. But if you think that you have a problem, you do. And if you are worried that you might develop a problem, digital detox and gaming detox and gambling detox, the so-called dopamine detox that she suggests, this fasting, seems to make a lot of sense, and there's very little risk.
So would it be fair to say that perhaps the first step to both prevention and managing is recognizing sort of
Always.
what's driving our behavior?
You know, yeah, I mean, they used to have drug testing in the workplace, and
Right.
sometimes people were relieved when they came up positive. If they didn't lose their job and they could enter treatment, it was a great relief. It's so complicated now. I'm working on a new article, and one of the experts at Harvard said that when a kid goes to the emergency room, in some states, they don't even do testing on them. So they'll admit to the least dangerous drug they used. But yes, in medicine, you can't treat the person without a diagnosis. And it's also part of the problem that we have in treating anyone. I mean, when we talk about someone as an opioid use disorder, the fact is that they have multiple drug disorders. And we just said, talking about dopamine, all drugs of abuse stimulate dopamine and cause changes in the brain that are associated with craving, wanting, and addiction. So when we wonder why it is that we can't cure opioid use disorder, well, you don't have to look very far, because most of those people have an alcohol use disorder and a cocaine use disorder, and smoke cigarettes and smoke cannabis, and we're just treating like one thing at a time, because the outcome measure that we're focused on, and rightly so, for opioid use disorder is being alive. So we don't pay very much or any attention to the other concurrent substance use disorders. And of course, that means we're not paying attention to their behavioral addictions. And of course, that means we're not paying attention to their psychiatric comorbidities and trauma. All of that conspires to make it appear that treatment doesn't work, when in reality, it can work, but probably not drug by drug by drug, because they're all subverting the dopamine system in slightly different ways, but net, in ways that make it impossible for the person to fully recover until we've addressed them all.
So, Mark, I'm going to schedule part 2 to this because of the relevancy of so much of what you've spoken about. And I think, there's a fair amount of misunderstanding about drugs, and, it's made into a moral decision, and other types of things that people really, have to understand where free will begins and ends, and sort of why they make the decisions they make. And also, as you said, there are a lot of co-occurring, we'll call it, issues that people are dealing with, whether they're using other substances or they're battling depression, anxiety, etc., and they feel better when they do X, Y, and Z. So it becomes a self-medication thing. I couldn't help also, as I was listening to you, I don't know why, but my mind drifted to Thoreau and Walden Pond, and back when, and the need to escape and to go on the self-discovery, but very much to do it away from what was then modern society.
That's a good thing to remind everyone. The same thing applies for sleep. Like, the best treatment for sleep is this kind of back to nature, day-night rhythm, and that probably means that you have to cut the cord and detox from all of the brain stimulation out there, or you never get a good night's sleep. I appreciate you and the podcast very much. It's one thing to write articles, but I like talking about it, and when people want other information, the fact they can find it is just really good.
Mark, I again just want to reference the terrific articles that you're writing for Psychology Today, which in very plain English explains some of the breakthroughs in research around behavioral therapies and substance use issues, etc. And the fact that you do this not as a reflection of what you are doing so much as what everyone else needs to know about the great work that's being done by many people who are your colleagues, but also people around the world that maybe you haven't fully connected with. So you're, I'll call it a great Sherpa through this informational forest that we have out there, and it's been absolutely enlightening, and again, I'll commend that to our listeners. But thanks again, Mark, and I'll look forward to our next conversation.
Okay, my pleasure. Be well.
Thanks for listening to this special edition episode of the RANE podcast series from RANE Network. Be sure to check out Dr. Mark Gold's full bio and host of written publications at psychologytoday.com. Want more of our content? Find the RANE podcast series wherever you get your podcasts, or visit our website at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. Thank you for listening.